Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
We have a very special show today. So we've got a double whammy. So I'm going to say that's Abdurrahim Green, and that is Abu Alia.
That's Abu Baker, and that. Oh, I still can't get these fingers with these cameras going all the other way, man. But anyway, and this is a piece of cake. The Green and Baker podcast with a special guest tonight. MashaAllah, tabarakallah.
MashaAllah. Allah bless you both. MashaAllah.
I mean, bro, what's happened to you? You've been in a fight because your tooth out, bro.
Yeah, tooth got knocked out. I have to have a denture thing in a couple of weeks.
May Allah, no pain like tooth pain, bro.
I'm telling you, subhanallah. So apologies to anyone who finds it a bit odd, but there you have it. Alhamdulillah.
No, we have you on the show. That's fine. MashaAllah.
I've been looking at it the whole podcast.
I'd like to say it's the toll, the cost of living in East London, but no, it's just decaying.
MashaAllah. But Abu Ali, I really want to say Jazakallah khair for coming on board. Piece of cake. Abdurrahim and I are really happy to link with you again, MashaAllah. And I think there's a number of things that we can get through. It's been a long journey that I think the three of us have been through, and we're continuing, obviously, with our journey, MashaAllah, tabarakallah. So I'm going to ask the initial question and go back down memory lane about when we first met you. And we have to say, one of the pioneers of Jimas, because you were one of the integral figures of Jimas in the 90s, mashallah. I remember your classes very, very fondly that we used to do across East London, you coming down to South London, Abdurrahim's study circles, in your flat, squeezing into your flat on the weekends, and all the brothers would converge from elsewhere. If you remember on the weekends that we would then disperse across the country. I don't think anything happens like that now. We disperse across the country from your flat to give dawah all over the weekend, mashallah.
And the other important point you forgot was Abu Muntasib would then order 35 portions of double chicken and chips and whatever for everyone for the evening meal before we dispersed in the morning.
Your chicken footage.
MashaAllah, yeah, absolutely.
So mashallah. So Abu Ali, tell me about some of your thoughts then. And Abdurrahim he's one of the old vanguard as well, even though he doesn't like to admit it, but he was there with you all. I remember when I first came into Jimas, and Abdurrahim study circles were the first place there that I knew, and very fond of those. Yourself, Abu Muntazir, Abu Sufyan, these figures, and mashallah, I think some of the late foundation.
Drag me into it, man. I was groomed by this guy over here. He groomed me, man. He groomed me into the cult.
I'm going to be the culprit today.
He's one of the cult member. People join the cult.
I actually, just on a more serious note, before we take off, you mentioned Abu Sufyan. So I know, speaking to you, Abdul Haq, I mentioned his condition. I don't know if you know Abdurrahim. So Abu Sufyan, he's now suffering with acute dementia. So
Abdul Haq told me, man, may Allah cure him and make everything easy for him and his family.
Ameen. So just to let you know there, alhamdulillah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
For some of our listeners, if they don't know Abu Sufyan, I think you can see him back in his prime and glory in Speaker's Corner. I think you can find some of those tapes on YouTube. Yeah, they're still out there. Yeah. I don't know if that classic talk he gave in Middlesbrough, what was it? The Islam, Christianity, and the BNP. What a brilliant talk that was. Yeah, search that and see if you can find it.
To add to the rap to reality, which I think was yours.
That was me and Abdul Haq doing the rap.
No, but was your sex, drug, and rock and roll? What is it?
No, but the one we did together was rap to reality, wasn't it? Well, that was yours, Abdul Haq. Yeah, you do rap to reality, and I would do my sex.
I remember that. Yeah, I remember it as being yours, and rock and roll thing was yours, mashallah.
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 So, listen, talk to us a little bit about your memories. What I think what we're interested in is, like where you were then and where you're at now and why. That's what interests. I think that's what interests everybody. Yeah. What is your viewpoint of the Salafi Dawah? How do you view it all now? And Marshall, I'm reading some of your articles on the Hanbalite, which I keep meaning to tell you, like, it sounds like a total oxymoron, that title, bro. But anyway, we'll have a discussion about that.
It's meant to be exactly that.
It's meant to be. It's like every time I read it, the Hanbalite. Like, I don't, that. But the articles, mashallah, tabarakallah. I don't want to unhumble your eye, but it's mashallah. It's they're very nice, and particularly enjoying the ones on which I think we might talk about. Your ones about scholars and going to the rulers, because it's a very important topic that I think we need to discuss about how do we interact with power and people of power, especially in the West. This is a very big challenge. But anyway, bro, how about you start with some thoughts about the Salafi Dawah, what happened, where are you at now, what that's what, yeah. Right, Abdul Haq, we're interested in that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
To tell the truth, guys, there's so many decades, three and a half decades since 1983 when I first met Abu Muntasir, late 83, and really took off in 84. There's so much that's happened, and one can gauge that by just listening to Abdul Haq's podcasts. Although he's taken it right up to the present time, but there is, he's just skimming over the years and the decades. Yeah. In one sense, following on from one of the earlier podcasts I heard from you both, where you were both trying to, I think Abdul Haq was saying he feels that we should reclaim the term Salafi. Abdul Rahim, from what I sense from you, was saying perhaps we should move on because it's just so murky. Didn't Sheikh Al-Albani say, if there isn't any clarity, then change the name, kind of thing. So just from that, I felt that, like you both quite rightly said, at one point it started with a good brotherhood, sisterhood. I think initially intentions were very, hopefully, inshallah, sincere. The energy of being young helped a lot. Very few responsibilities. And when we're young, we have a very idealistic notion of the world. We think we can change the world. We're not part of the rat race yet. And I think also, may Allah bless Abu Muntasir, perhaps one of the greatest things that Allah allowed him to give us is that he said, look, even if it's halal to take money, let's just do it from our own pockets. Our intentions will be better. Allah will bless us more, so on and so forth. And that kind of became a real staple of our dawah, that we're just trying to do it out of whatever Allah gives us. And that helped keep sincerity. But as numbers grow, as time goes on, Iman fluctuates. You both said it in one of your earlier podcasts. Not that we became a clique, a cult, but there were cultish elements. But that's not something unique, I think, to the Salafi grouping, Jimas in the 90s. I think that's one can look at some of the Sufi tariqas today and see within individuals and members cultish behavior. One can see that, football fans and whatever. I think cultish behavior just tends to be what happens when we're not always on the ball. Sincerity kind of wavers, power, different ideas, competition, clashing. So there was cult. My problem wasn't really the cult, and my problem has really never been the cult. I've discussed this with Abdul Haq, saying that I actually think just the whole thing on Salafism, we got the wrong end of the stick. And when I look at what goes on under the term Salafi, I still think a lot of people have got the wrong end of the stick, and they're not very far from getting it right. The idea of, I think Abdurrahim expressed it best in one of the earlier podcasts of, you know, we still have an attachment to the Sahaba, the Tabi'un, the great Imams and the Salaf of the past. And you're right, if we were to ask most, and I'm referring back to this podcast that I heard from you both, you were both right when you said if you were to ask the majority of Muslims, who do they attach themselves to in terms of religious righteousness and correctness, they may not use the term Salaf, but they will certainly say Sahaba, early scholars, our Buzurg, our noble and venerable ones. Whatever terms they use, they are identifying with that cadre, a grouping of people, Sahaba, Tabi'un, Tabi'un, who we lovingly refer to, and within our literature, they are lovingly referred to as the Salaf, the predecessors. And we had Saleh, Salaf al-Saleh, to weed out anyone in that generation who was an innovator, who was not righteous. So Wasil ibn Atta, second generation Muslim, the Mu'tazila school of thought is kind of attributed to him. He was from the Tabi'un, the time of Hassan al-Basri. We don't consider him to be one of our Salaf or Salaf al-Saleh, even though he was a second generation Muslim, because he had a belief, an aqidah, which was false, which went against the aqidah of the Sahaba and the Tabi'un. So yeah, that's correct. But all Salaf meant was we follow the Salaf. Salaf is not singular, as we know; it's plural. It meant to follow the unanimous agreement of the Sahaba or the Tabi'un or the Tabi'un. So what we get here, there's a term for unanimous agreement that I know all of us know what that Scottish term is: ijma.
Ijma, yeah,
consensus. All it meant was where the Salaf have a consensus, everyone who knows about it is bound to it. Where they legitimately differ, then either the person is a mujtahid at some level, able to weigh up the proof text and then follow their conclusion, or someone is not a mujtahid and relies upon following qualified scholarship. But Salafism today, or Salafiyya today, or even back in the days in the late 80s, early 90s, if you cast your mind back, we kind of defined ourselves with the way we pray.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I remember we had these discussions, didn't we, Ro? It was like, it was Salafiyya was more about fiqh than it was about aqidah, which was like so weird. Like that was the first thing that was like so strange.
Absolutely.
And also, Abu Ali, if I can interject, one of the things, Abu Ali, you were the first. I remember when you saw this emergence of this testing and this sort of this vociferous trend coming, and I remember you saying, because you and I used to speak a lot, used to say these individuals are making furu subsidiary issues, usuli issues.
Absolutely.
And I know they even tried to attack you for that, to dismiss that. And that's continued 20 odd years later. And you bought the hadith. It was you who bought the hadith. I remember you saying the hadith where it said that the sigar, the one about the sigar criticizing or disparaging the kibar. And I remember we're going back in the 90s when you were saying this. And I remember listening very carefully because those signs were emerging and they're manifest now. So carry on, please, because there's a lot I remember from that time, mashallah.
So I remember in my heart, in my mind, I remember how keenly you would listen. Because most people wouldn't keenly listen. There was about a handful of people that I felt, rightly or wrongly, that were keenly listening. You, Abdurrahim Green, one or two others were from amongst them. Just one point, though. I don't think anyone could groom you, Abdurrahim. I think, mashallah, Allah's just given you something.
Impossible.
No, joking, bro. I was totally joking. Bro.
You're a maverick.
I came in full. I came in with my eyes wide open, bro. Believe me, I was like,
Abdurrahim. Remember, Abdurrahim, two things. when you were in Guyana and someone said, there's the Lord. And then also when you used to go Hyde Park, some of the non-Muslims used to think you were Jesus because of your white clothes and everything like that. But let's be frank, as he said, you are incorruptible. I saw you as the maverick. I remember you confronted. You were a maverick, Aki. Come on. Abdul Rahim. Abu Ali, remember, if there was anyone to confront Abu Muntazir and say, I'm not following that, and he had his own position, it would be Abdul Rahim.
Abu Sufyan as well.
Abu Sufyan, but Abdul Rahim, when you were one of them, don't try and shy away from that. But it was good. That was the good thing about us. We weren't blindly following or partisan in that way, which was that was an excellent element of the characteristics of many of the brothers there, mashallah.
Indeed. So going back to that point, all the Salaf all following the Salaf.
Yeah.
I'll use the word following the Salaf rather than Salafi for the moment, if you permit. All it meant was, as we agree here, is following the ijma, the consensus of the Salaf. Where they differed, there was never a Salafi way. There were ways that different individual people from the Salaf took. So there was never a Salafi way of praying. There was never a Salafi way of can I recite Quran to pass on the blessings from the to the deceased? All there was some of the Salaf, Imam Ahmad, Abu Hanifa, took that view, passing on the blessings by reading the Quran, and Imam Shafi didn't take that view, for example. So there's no Salafi way about it. Ibn al-Qayyim rahmatullah alayhi said in one of his works that became the majority way of the Salaf of doing so, but it wasn't the Salafi way because there was always a small difference. People who followed that Imam Shafi view, even though the Shafi school settled on doing it later on. All it was what they agreed upon. And there were, in foundational issues, there are very few things that they agreed upon. I mean, I'm not saying 2 or 3, 10, 20, 50, 80. But the majority was just vast differences in tafsir of this verse, in 50 issues and whatever. So that's point one. Point two is those who identify and have always identified with the madhab of the Salaf. So let's leave Imam Ibn Taymiyyah. Let's take anyone before Imam Ibn Taymiyyah. So I'm going to pick on Ibn Qudama, half a generation before Ibn Qudama. So he was really the Salafi Imam of his time. Okay, all it was is anyone who followed the madhab of the Salaf, they believed that in the matters of Allah's names and attributes, we don't do figurative interpretation because we didn't see the Sahaba doing it, we didn't see the Tabi'un doing it. However, we know from people like Imam Nawawi and other great scholars that Imam Nawawi says, actually, on the issue of figurative interpretations in Allah's names, the majority of the Salaf refused to do ta'wil, figurative interpretation, but a minority did. But we know scholars before Imam Nawawi and during Imam Nawawi who say, no, there was no minority. All those reports are not credible reports that say that some of the Salaf did figurative interpretation. What we have clear cut from them, especially Imam Ahmad, is no ta'wil. So here, there's a difference of opinion. I as a student of knowledge, we as students of knowledge recognize that actually there are some reports going back to Imam Ahmad and perhaps Imam Malik and a few others, where they seemingly did figurative interpretation. However, I follow that opinion of those scholars and the proofs that they have to say actually those are very non-credible reports. And therefore what I'm left with is the Salaf never did ta'wil. Whoever takes that view, the Salaf never did figurative interpretation in the attributes, was a Salafi, was upon the madhab of the Salaf. It's not that Ibn Qudama didn't recognize that, oh, there are some reports attributed to Imam Ahmad or Malik or whoever that they did some type of figurative interpretation sometimes on rare occasions. It's that he and others like him dismissed them as not being credibly authentic. And those who take that view like us, that's what makes us from the madhab of the Salaf, a follower of the Salafi way. It's not how we pray. It's not whether we join the tariqah or not. It's not what fiqh school we may or may not belong to. It's simply that in the attributes of Allah, we believe there is an ijma. The Salaf were unanimous in rejecting figurative interpretation. Following on from that, they were unanimous, as we believe, of rejecting most of rational theology, ilmul kalam, to defend the aqidah of the Salaf. We believe that they didn't like doing that and rejected most, if not all of that vehemently. And we believe, following on from that, Iman increases and decreases, and it includes statement and actions. And what the connection is, we may not be able to explain it fully, but there's a connection between statements and actions and Iman increasing and decreasing. Those 2 or 3 things identified a person as Salafi Mu'taqid. So the word Salafi is, I hate to go down this road. The word Salafi here is an adjective. It's describing a noun. The noun Aqidah is a noun. And then whenever we see a report from Ibn Taymiyyah describing someone early, or Imam Dhahabi describing someone early, they quite often they would say Salafi Mu'taqid, Salafi I'tiqad. His Aqidah was Salafi. It was, I think you can count on less than 3 fingers, if I, from what I remember. It's almost impossible to find anyone using Salafi as a noun, and a Salafi, I'm a Salafi. Not only was it's almost impossible to find an early scholar using that term, it was impossible to.
Told you that. I said, I told you, bro.
Oh, did I side with one of these?
I told you in the last part. I said the same thing. I said you'd be hard pressed to find anything of a Salaf calling himself Salafi. So that I'd said that in one of our little, when we had little dig-nong about using the term Salafi as a noun, like describing yourself as a Salafi.
Absolutely. But what we do have, though, is great scholars from the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th century onwards, scholars, especially these scholars and historians, sometimes when they're describing an early scholar, like the grandson of Abu Hanifa, they would describe him as being Salafi in Aqidah. So we know that the term Salafi was not invented by Ibn Taymiyyah or Sheikh Ibn Abdul Wahhab or Bin Baz or Al-Albani or whomsoever, rahimahumullah ajma'in. We know that it's a righteous scholarly description that was used by great scholars. But here's the point: the scholars that when we find an individual in the biographical genre, Imam Dhahabi Sirah al-Nubala, and Imam Dhahabi saying, oh, he was Salafi in Aqidah, he was upon the Salafi way. One, they're referring to qualified scholars, never a layperson. Two, there are hardly many people like that. And 3, more importantly, it was only describing their religious stance vis-a-vis Allah's names and attributes.
Yeah, that's right.
Interpretation. Right. And does Iman increase and decrease? And perhaps their stance towards ilmul kalam, rational theology, to defend that.
I think Abu Ali and Mashra is very interesting, but I think that the term, as it's used in modern times, has morphed totally from what you're talking about. So from what I can understand is that the more modern usage of the term Salafiyya is a bit more wide and comprehensive. Well, when I say wide, it's a wider in its application than merely talking about Allah's name. I mean, it goes to, what it goes back to is, and this is what we talked about in the previous podcast, and I talked about my experience coming out of Catholicism, right? Which I admit has, like I said, experiences shape you, right? So from my background and my knowledge of Christianity, how the message of Jesus was perverted and changed and corrupted, and how Catholicism is really nothing left. I mean, it's all innovations in aqidah and in fiqh and everything. There's like, you know, what is there left of the true religion of Jesus in that religion they call Catholicism? So for me, you know, so now the term Salafi for me means a little bit more than just, you know, what you've talked about, right? Because it seems to me without doubt that there are many things that are practiced amongst Muslims, right? And you've traveled, bro. You and me have traveled many different places in the world, and we've seen it. We've seen many different practices, many superstitions, all sorts of amalgamations between, you know, bringing in elements of Buddhism and Hinduism. I mean, I'm still pretty much stand by my studies that have identified so many of the concepts of Sufism is just Hinduism. It is pure Hinduism, all right? I mean, of extreme Sufism, you know, the similarity between the adulation and sort of literally unquestioning follow of a sheikh, and how Hinduism teaches to follow gurus, the concept of to the basic concept of God. God, you know, God being everywhere and in everything, and you are God, I'm God, everything, the rat's God, the whole universe is God, right? This is prevalent, right, in Sufi beliefs, bro. So you know, like, and this is common in the Muslim world. You ask a lot of people, right? You know it. They say, where is God? They'll say everywhere, and some of them are really confused about these things. So I think it's like, it's a bit wider today, like, because we're, you know, like, things of the level of corruption and the level of way. I mean, I admit it, I'm quite puritanical. I just think that we'd be a lot better off just sticking to those few basic things, which we can't even get them right. Like, we can't even get basic adab and akhlaq right. Why are we going around celebrating Milad and Nabi, singing songs and going on processions and sitting in dhikr circles and whatever, right? Okay. Forget whether these things are within what's permissible or not. Why don't we just stick to the few basic things that we need to do and just get them right, right? It seems to me that there's so much corruption, there's so much distortion, and the way it goes is like the Prophet said, you know, you will follow those people who came before you, step by step, handspan by handspan. If one of them went down the hole of the lizard, one of you will do the same, right? So for me, bro, the Salafi path means trying to find a way. I know it's like, you know, I've realized in my older age that it's very, you know, that it's a very idealistic and, you know, simplistic thing, right? And I know the modern world has thrown at us so many challenges that our fiqh in the past, you know, like, you can't. I realize that there's things from the fiqh of the past that you just don't apply to us today, right? Like, it needs rethinking. I get all of that. So not everything is just found in just going back, because you can't go back. We live in the modern world and we have to deal with the modern world. But I think in some respects, bro, that's what it is. So, you know, it's not completely divorced from fiqh. I mean, I think this was Al-Albani's sort of argument, wasn't it? It's that, look, we need to try and, you know, like, scrape away some of this stuff that, you know, this stuff that's just accrued, that doesn't really seem to have a firm basis, you know, a firm basis. And I think there's this link as well, a modern link perhaps, right, between Ahl al-Hadith, right, the people of Hadith. And this is a whole nother issue, right? Ahl al-Ray and Ahl al-Hadith, you know. So the Salafi Dawah, the modern Salafi Dawah, has also, you know, like, attached itself to this, which is a slightly different, you know, conflict between Ahl al-Ray and Ahl al-Hadith. So that Salafi Aqidah has also linked itself to that grounding, or you know, maybe, you know, it's a narrower view, but, you know, that approach of being more focused on the Hadith, being more focused on, you know, the traditions, rather than, you know, the way of opinion and race. So Allahu alam, you know, I think it's sort of, I think the modern idea of Salafiyya is sort of a little bit more perhaps comprehensive. What are your thoughts on what I'm saying there?
I think if I can interject there at that point, I think fascinating, the conversation. I think on the tail end of what Abu Ali is saying, and you, Abdurrahim, when we look at the modern referencing of Salafi, you're absolutely right. When we look back, it was Madhab al-Salaf, that was what was there. But when we look at what the Kibar, Sheikh Al-Albani particularly, brought with this descriptor, why use the term Salafi, it was in the face of post-colonial movements. It was in the face of what we saw with the Muslim Brotherhood and these beliefs, and as you said, Abdurrahim, Sufism, and the most reprehensible forms, extreme Sufism. So that identification of the fundamentals was something that needed to be distinguished, looking at what was happening with Muslims. Now, I understand and I acknowledge, I'd say, I'm not going to say I accept, I acknowledge the overemphasis that began to take place with the term Salafi. What we're seeing now, and I've said that in the Chronicles of UK Salafism, I say it to the chagrin of other Salafis, that what happened is that Salafis in the West, some elements of Salafis, actually bastardized the term Salafiyah and co-modified it to the extent where they were doing it with distorted, I would say, or newly coined principles, just from the point of distinguishing even further within the Salafi movement itself. And talking about the Salafi movement, the question comes, is the Salafi movement something that we should be adhering to? And in my observations and speaking to the ulama that I'm close to and the students of knowledge, the movement is what became the problem. When it initially emerged, I think with the Sheikh Al-Albani and the Dawah that he was propagating, mashallah tabarakallah, and these students and those from Sheikh Ibn Baz, Sheikh Uthaymeen, there was a purity to that. And I believe that we were recipients of that during the 90s. As time moved on and with the passing of these kibar ulama, and we have other ulama there, obviously, mashallah tabarakallah, what we saw, as I said, I'll use the phrase again, is a co-modification. And that co-modification wasn't taking place amongst the scholars. That was taking place amongst our own ranks within the West in order to displace particular precepts and methodological approaches, to use them again in a bastardized, commodified way. I'll be frank in saying that. We know when we were taught Jah wa Ta'deel in the 90s, Abdurrahim, reading from Dawud Burbank's translated notes, we didn't go around disparaging anyone from that. We knew and we applied the principle as it was being taught. However, that transfer of it from where it was being used classically to where it is now, by those laypersons who can't even call themselves students of knowledge, is where the bastardization started taking place. And sadly, it morphed into what we see now. So with me, you're right. I know you were smiling with the term calling yourself Salafi. I agree with you with the origins of it. I really do agree with you on that. But from the point of distinguishing, as Sheikh Al-Albani had said at that particular point, looking at where we are today, looking at the rates of apostasy from Muslims now as well, with these alien concepts that are confusing them, I'm not saying we should use it doggedly. I say one thing, we shouldn't say, yeah, I'm part of a Salafi movement, not where it is now, because that is where cultism has gone. But being Salafi in adhering to those principles and the methodological approach, if it's used in that context alone, okay, with a small s, as I mentioned in my chronicles, as a small s, and maybe going back to, as you said, the noun being Aqidah, Abu Alia, then there shouldn't be an issue with that. Unfortunately, I think there's a simplicity amongst the wider Salafi movement, and I'll end with that, and I'm using the term movement, where there's such a haughtiness and disdain for any challenge to take it away from being a noun, that anyone like myself, like us, are labeled or disparaged as heretics, or we've gone off the manhaj for even trying to reference it back to its original premise.
I think between you both, mashallah, you've covered a lot.
I thought you were going to say that.
So let me see if I can tie a few threads in. Please just stop me whenever whenever you think I'm just rattling on. The reason why I mentioned how the term Salafi was used early on was just to show that the way it's been used today, even by Sheikh Al-Albani, it was different than how it was used before. This is this is very evident in how Sheikh Al-Albani uses it. So for this discussion, I'm not going to try to reference or refer to how some of the brothers of Salafi publications or other people use the term Salafi. It's unfair to describe an Islamic concept, a good Islamic concept, by its possibly weakest or less informed followers. Rather, we should pick on the ulama who represent that idea.
Right.
Albani, for example, represented this idea of Salafism in modern times. Sheikh Albani's idea of Salafism, and he didn't hide it, was that he moved it from an adjective. It's not that he didn't use it as an adjective, but he also used it as a noun, and a Salafi, and a Salafi. And he brought in fiqh. And it's not that he said, well, whatever is mujma' alayh, ijma', that is our Salafi fiqh, and whatever it isn't. No, he was saying that we need to go through the whole of fiqh and weed out those fiqhi fatwas that are based upon evidences. But the vast majority of scholars, and they had seen this happen before, their objection was that an individual scholar, or even a few scholars, weeding out what they think is the weakest opinion is just an opinion. I'm talking about scholarly opinion, but it is nonetheless just an opinion. It's a bit like Imam Malik, Abu Hanifa, Shafi, and Imam Ahmed getting together, of course, different times, but let's imagine they were together and they're going to decide to weed out between them the strongest opinions. I picked on the wrong four because they just happen to be the four mega scholars of the age, but they wouldn't be able to weed out other than a few bits and pieces in which there is an ijma. Sheikh Albani ended up by saying, look, the reality is, look, we felt that this was the Salafi way to pray. This was the Salafi way to wear hijab. The Salafi way was not to celebrate or commemorate the 15th night of Sha'ban. And when you have fiqh issues being made into a division amongst Muslims, then Ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullah alayh, and not just Ibn Taymiyyah, but I'm picking on Ibn Taymiyyah because I assume that the audience might be more familiar, given the fact that we're from a Salafi background. Ibn Taymiyyah mentions that, look, when you argue over a furu issue and you make it beyond furu, you're following the way of the Khawarij in splitting the ummah, not making it clear, in splitting the ummah. And he gave an example. In his time, apparently, I don't know how big it was, but it was big enough for him to write a lengthy letter. He's saying that you Sunnis, somewhere he's writing to some people somewhere in the Muslim world, you Sunnis are arguing over whether the disbelievers will see Allah in the hereafter. He says there is a consensus that the believers will be gifted with seeing Allah, the beatific vision, in the hereafter. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us all amongst them. As regards to the disbelievers, even though there's a vast majority opinion on Sunnis who say no, they will not see God. That's kind of the worst punishment you can have. I mean, if hellfire is bad, not being able to see God is worse, right? But a minority of Sunnis felt that on accountable the day of actual judgment, they will, and they'll see God, and they'll be in a state of trepidation. Ibn Taymiyyah simply says, look, you're fighting over it. You've come to physical blows. This is the way of the Khawarij. Why is it the way of the Khawarij? He said, because you've split the ummah on an issue which is not mujma' alayh, which is not agreed upon, which is not consensus over it. So now, fast forward that. The intention of wanting to follow the early Muslim scholars and believing that there is an ijma', consensus on no ta'wil in no figurative interpretation of the names and attributes, and none of that, and none of this, and none of that. That's a praiseworthy thing, which I hope that everyone who has that intention will get rewarded for. But Islam does real time, okay? Islam does it like, well, what's happening on the ground? So Islam has ideals, but also Islam says, well, what's happening on the ground? And if what's happening on the ground doesn't quite match up to the ideals, there will be some kind of change. Islam will expect some kind of change. What was happening on the ground is that from Sheikh Albani's time onwards, for one reason or the other, Salafism became an issue of not of like, we don't do madhabs, even though the majority of the scholars of the Salaf and those who follow that path did. We don't do this, we don't do that. And everything that we don't do as Salafis in the 90s, for example, we found that actually the majority of scholars did. And not only were we not doing, which is fine, because a minority opinion is an acceptable opinion, but we were dividing. Maybe you and he and he weren't actually dividing, but on the whole, as an aggregate, our dawah was dividing on difference of opinion issues.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
Once a dawah, see, individual mistake. Ibrahim says to me, Abu Aliyah, why are you banging on about X? I said, because isn't there an ijma on it? Isn't it? No, Abu Ali, there's a difference of opinion. I said, make tawbah, go to the people who I messed it up with the apologies. I might do it again next year. And then Abdul Haq comes to me and says, Abu Ali, why are you dividing on furu issues? Oh my, subhanallah, I didn't know it was a legitimate difference of opinion. At least I've got my basics right. What's the basics? I can't divide on legitimate differences. But my weakness is I don't have enough knowledge to know the details of what those legitimate differences may or may not be in some issues. That's fine. And maybe you can excuse me. I hope God will excuse me. But if I'm not even aware of the concept, and I just think, well, I don't even have this concept of difference of opinion, not difference of opinion, usul furu, and that becomes generic. And even down to scholars and sheikhs and tullab, students of knowledge, not being clear about that, then you actually have a huge problem. So by 95, I'll tell you a kind of story which wraps up with something that I saw going on in the net. So the late Dawud Burbank, rahmatullah alayh, Abu Talha, in 94, he was commissioned by, I think, Al-Bidayah to do a book. And so Dawud phoned me and he asked what book, and I said, oh, what about this, this, and this? And one of them that I mentioned, he said, oh, I've got that in my list to do. And it was Sharh Sunnah of al-Barbahari. So we thought, fantastic, since this book is on my list of doing and your list of doing, go for it. And at that time, Dawud said a second edition, scholarly edition, is coming out by a sheikh called Sheikh al-Radadi, Khalid al-Radadi. There was one edition at that time by Sayyid al-Qahtani as his PhD, and it got turned into a book. But there was a second edition coming out, so all the more to do it. And a few months later, Dawud Abu Talha phones me up and he says, issue with translating the book. What's the issue? He says, did you know that this book might not be Imam Barbahari's?
Yeah, I heard this. The first time I heard this recently. Yeah.
I said, I have no idea. I have no idea. From what I recall, I said it's not in Qahtani's introduction. He doesn't mention that at all. He goes, no, it's in the new introduction by Radadi. Radadi says that the only manuscript we have. Anyway, I won't get into that. One of the issues was Barbahari might not have written the book. It could have been an earlier Hanbali scholar, Ghulam Khalil. I said, no problem. Is Ghulam Khalil a scholar? He goes, yes. Was he a Hanbali scholar? Yes. It doesn't matter. It's a book by a Hanbali scholar of an early period. If it's Ghulam Khalil, mashallah, we get more points because he's 100 years earlier. If it's Barbahari, not a problem. Nobody knows Barbahari anyway at that time in the English-speaking world. I said, okay, so that's done and dusted. We just stick with what Radadi says. Sheikh Radadi, in his research, what is his conclusion? Dawud said 4 points, and he feels these 4 points lend weight to Barbahari being the author. I said, go for it, Bismillah. Within about 2 years, I actually then differed from that conclusion because I had a third edition came out and I was convinced that Barbahari wasn't. It made no difference because we weren't fixated because of Barbahari, although he was a legend in himself in terms of how he was, in his adherence of Sunnah, a bit more charismatic than Ghulam Khalil. But we were interested in what the book actually said. I said, so what's the second point? And now the second point was like, he said, Barbahari says about the attributes, we don't do ta'wil, we don't give tafsir, we don't do tafweed. Now, I'm not going to go into, if the viewers don't understand, and I'm not going to go into it here because I don't want to, make this podcast some kind of deep student of knowledge interaction. It's not going to be fair on the audience, I think, unless, of course, you insist. But tafweed, we had a particular Ibn Taymiyyah view of tafweed. We believe that we don't ask how the attributes are, but we know what they mean. But they mean whatever they mean, with the fact that Allah doesn't resemble his creation and vice versa. Yeah. But I already knew by that time, Ibn Qudama actually says we do tafweed because we are not obliged to know the meaning of the attribute. And I know that Ibn Taymiyyah had strong words indirectly against Ibn Qudama and his grandfather, the Imam of the Hanbali Madhab in his time, and nearly all of his teachers on this issue, and his teachers' teachers, because he mentions this in Majmu' al-Fatawa, that I have issued, they got it wrong. When Barbahari comes along saying the word tafweed, I said to Dawud, at that time, I haven't thought about it deeply, but it was just adding to my, that's funny. Okay. I said to Dawud, brother Dawud, just add a footnote. Don't. I said, I think it's best to academically translate exactly what he says, and then any interpretation or meaning that we think he means, we should put it in a footnote, which is what Abu Talha Dawud did, rahmatullah alayhi. He explained that tafweed here means...
I'm going to have to open that. Do you remember what page it was? I have to go down to my library and pull it out. Near the beginning, I guess, right?
Yeah, about point 29 or something like that. Yeah. Anyway, but the point was, I thought, oh, tafweed. And then during that time, I'm reading a booklet from Ibn Rajab, and he says the same thing. He says, and we leave the meaning to the one who says it. And what was kind of bugging me was, why can't they be clear like Ibn Taymiyyah? I later on come to find out by 97, 98, that no one other than Ibn Taymiyyah says the sentence like we know how we Salafis say the sentence. We don't know the how, but we know the meaning. No one of the Hanbali, Athari, Salafi pedigree of scholars before Ibn Taymiyyah, or even after Ibn Taymiyyah, from his students, use that phrase.
How about, wasn't it Imam Malik? The guy comes and asks him.
Indeed. But that's the point. It's not that, so in all cases, let's make this as a foregone conclusion. In all cases, when Ibn Taymiyyah argues any point to do with any point of part of religion, he's going to have some serious proofs. This is not going to be off the cuff. His thinking is not going to be a piece of cake. It's going to be measured, deep, thorough. So we are not discussing, does Ibn Taymiyyah have a reason why he says this? He fleshes out his reason in 5 solid pages of arguments with his characteristic sharpness. The issue is, what was the madhab of the Salaf prior to Ibn Taymiyyah? What it seems to be, at least openly, is when Ibn Taymiyyah is saying none of my teachers got it right and none of my teachers' teachers. I mean, he has a very nice way of saying it. We at least know that he believes there is a disconnect between what he's saying and he believes to be the madhab of the Salaf on this point and the last 100, maybe 150 years. It just made me think. I mean, Sheikh Saleh al-Sheikh, who was quite a young scholar at that time, but still an amazing scholar at that time, And one other Salafi Sheikh, I think it could have been Ibn Jibreel. At that time, I remember reading saying, MashaAllah, see Ibn Taymiyyah, he has so much courage. He's ready to stick with what he believes to be the truth, even if it goes against his teachers and his teachers' teachers. But my mind was working the opposite. It wasn't, you don't need to convince me of Taymiyyah courage. That's done and dusted in my mind. Okay? But you do now need to convince me as a kind of a real struggling Salafi that how can we have this, there will never cease to be a group of Ummah victorious upon the truth or evidently upon the truth until the hour is established. How can we have 150 years and someone doesn't know the sifat of Allah on a major point? I remember putting this to some of the Salafi Mashayikh. And you know what? There was almost an ijma of interesting question, Abu Alia. We'll have to look into that. I asked 2 Jordanians, 2 Saudis, and 1 Kuwaiti this question, sheikhs, with varying levels of knowledge, but all far above me or anyone that I knew in the UK. And they almost said the same thing. It's as if they had phoned each other and kind of concurred on an answer to give me, which they didn't. Literally, they said that. My point being is, why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this for what Abdurrahman says, that today's Salafism isn't quite like what it was in the past. And to that, I'll say, Alhamdulillah, as long as that is recognized, then I have very little problem with anything called Salafism, modern day Salafism, Sufi movement conceptually. What I will have a problem with, though, and which is why 1997, 98, I kind of like, I went wherever I went was, as long as people are saying that is the original Islam, we've got this traditional Islam, no, but we're on original Islam. As long as they say this is original Islam, I have a huge problem with that, because that is.
I can understand. It's dangerous. I can understand that.
So,
bro, listen. The thing is, bro, listen, right? See, yeah, you know,
so,
again, yeah, go on, finish it.
So, I actually don't really have so much of a problem, for example, with the likes of Salafi publications, in the sense that if they really, for example, Allah bless anyone who is hardcore on, you know what, let's just say the Salafi Aqidah is, let's just move Ibn Taymiyyah and just say, when we say Salafi Aqidah, we mean anything before the 6th century, okay? Let's just say, for argument's sake now, I'm following the Salafi Aqidah and the Ash'ari Aqidah is wrong. I have no problem with that. As long as you're saying it to the right people in the right time and not making, you know, someone who's not praying into, giving out of priority, no problem. I have no problem someone who says that actually, if you can look at it from one angle, you can actually say that Ash'aris and Athari Salafis are all Ahl Sunnah. I also have no problem with that. Same thing, as long as it's based upon scholarly understanding and you're not making a big issue with it. So the problem today isn't really with people having different ideas and understandings. As one of you quite rightly said, modernity has thrown up so many, so many curveballs. We just, we have to kind of rethink so many things. My issue is that at least don't say that such and such is the Athari Salafi way, based largely on Imam Ibn Taymiyyah and a set of scholars who followed 700, 600 years later, I think include Sheikh Ibn Abdul Wahab, because research will verify, and here's the point, here is something which is not subjective, it's objective. Research will verify that that's not true. Just research, and I've done a lot of that even in English, but there's just so much out there. If someone says I'm Salafism on the path of Sheikh Al-Albani, as opposed to on the path of earlier still, I think we can kind of live. We should and we could live with that. I think this is just an opinion, a subjective opinion. Just like a subjective opinion, if we agree on the usul, and both of you I felt were cross-wired. Sheikh Abdurrahim said that at the end. As you said in the end, I think we're cross wires with each other. So you're asking for a change in the name of Salafiyya because it just doesn't mean, it means mostly bad, not just to Muslims, to the world at large now. And Abu Haq is about reclaiming the name. So let's agree with this, at least on Sheikh al-Albani's principles, because it's primarily Sheikh al-Albani's principles. Ahl Sunnah from 400 years, 500 years before Sheikh al-Albani, even when the Ash'aris were there, they didn't say, let's change the name. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, being one of those long line of humbly scholars who are against Ash'aris, he starts his Aqidah Wasatiyya with هذه اعتقاد, you know, the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. He calls it Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the Aqidah of Firqatul Najat al-Mansura, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah ila Qiyam al-Sa'ah. Let's at least historically agree that it was more or less, with one or two scholars before Sheikh al-Albani, but it was more or less Sheikh al-Albani who pushed this idea that Ahl Sunnah is just so unclear now. If you're coming from a Madhab of the Salaf perspective, of course, it was unclear by the 5th century when Ghazali was born. It was unclear what Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is from the 8th century. Ibn Taymiyyah was there. You had Hanbali Athari Aqidah, then you had Ash'ari Aqidah, and both claimed Ahl Sunnah. And it was certainly unclear when Sheikh al-Albani was around. But Sheikh al-Albani made a decisive break with the historic past, and he said it's so unclear, we need a new term, or we'll pull out from the hat a historic term and make it new. It wasn't that scholars in the past decided to use the word Salafi. It was Sheikh al-Albani. So let's use his principle. Sheikh al-Albani's principle is this: if a pure word or a pure term that helps define authentic Islam or orthodox Islam, if the pure term that defines orthodox Islam at some point becomes hazy, then we should get another pure term to define orthodox Islam, because one of the things about orthodoxy, it must be distinguished from heterodoxy. There is an obligation to distinguish haqq from batil, sunnah from bid'ah, orthodoxy from heterodoxy. So we agree on the principle, that Sheikh al-Albani's principle. Sheikh al-Albani's principle was, if a pure term that distinguishes orthodoxy becomes muddied, then we should find another term to make it clear again. Now, the question of how much does it have to be muddied, for how long, and what term to use thereafter, those are all subjective. Those were not, Ibn Taymiyyah, Sheikh al-Albani didn't receive revelation. He didn't follow the Salaf in this, did he?
No.
He did it from his own mind. He thought in the 14th century, let's say 80 years ago, for argument's sake, we need to use the word Salafi in a very strong, in a far more stronger, decisive manner. It wasn't that he had a precedence for this. He had a precedent to distinguish truth from falsehood. Name to us your men, Ibn Sirin, Sahih Muslim. If they said people of Sunnah, we would accept their narrations. If not, then not, or words to that effect. But when do you change it, and to what, is very ijtihadi. So actually, both of you, in this sense, could both rightly represent the Albanian approach, because you both agree that because even you, that you want to cling on to the term and purify it, but you don't disagree with the principle that if it becomes muddied beyond repair, move on to another term. You just don't think it's beyond repair. You think it's salvageable. Ustad Abdurrahim Green doesn't think it's salvageable. But you both agree in the principle. Okay? Then those kind of things, you know, fine, they wouldn't make a difference. The big difference is that at least we know that Salafism today, not just in its cliquey movement, hierarchy form, but even as a concept amongst students of knowledge and even sheikhs, is slightly disconnected with what it was from the past. in principle, not just in detail. And that is something that is objectively one can see and research, not subjective. Now, someone just, sorry, I've gone on. My only last point is, of course, if a person isn't looking into all of this, they won't know. But we generally have that rule of thumb that the one who has the evidence is the one who should be followed.
Absolutely, and I'd say Jazakallah khair, Abu Ali, really for unpacking it. And I think as we draw to a conclusion, I think Abdul Rahim and I would say you're coming back to part two.
You don't want me to come back, I'm telling you.
No, podcast tends to be a bit more interactive, although like the fact that me and Abdul Haq said nothing just shows how fascinated we were. MashaAllah, we really enjoyed it, inshallah, alhamdulillah. I think in fact, bro, we're gonna have to get you back on again because there's so much more that we want to talk about, to be honest, bro.
Okay, can I just say something which I've been meaning to say to you both, and there's one or two others that I would like to say for maybe 12, 15 years now. Actually, the dawah that you were doing, grassroots, Abdurrahim was much more of an international traveler than yourself or myself, but you were also doing grassroots, just primarily in Brixton, just bringing people from Iman to Kufr and strengthening Iman.
The other way around. I hope
not. From my brothers, subhanallah.
I know you. That was just
from kufr to iman and strengthening their love for Islam.
Yeah,
that probably has more kind of serious hasanat with our Lord than some of the details that were only going to apply to about 10 people in this whole world, someone like I was dealing with, and that probably still applies even today. So actually, even though this is fascinating and I'm glad you're interested, and some foundations probably need to be revised and thought of, actually, alhamdulillah, Allah has blessed you in ways that perhaps you realize or you don't. May Allah bless you. The people that I meet that, just say, I love God, I love Allah, I love the Sunnah of the Prophet, and it goes back to very often Abdul Rahim, but also yourself, and one or two other people, including Abu Sufyan. I couldn't imagine there being, more than like 3 people on this earth who would say that about Abu Ali. They might say some nice
things. Listen, I'll tell you something, bro. There's a lot more people than you think. And just because your name is not there, it doesn't mean that those articles you wrote, that Al-Hidayah magazine, bro, that you, subhanAllah, literally published by you, bro, the impact of that. Yeah, Al-Iman, bro, and Istiqama, bro. Wasn't it Istiqama, yeah?
Yeah,
I've still got them somewhere. I've still got them. The articles, listen, and how many of my talks and Abdul Haq's talks and lectures and khutbahs were taken from those articles. So, bro, don't underestimate your contribution, and don't over humble your eye. and there, Abu Ali, to be honest, I think, bro, mashallah. Listen, what you said about yourself is not true either, because no, you were not dealing with stuff that was only concerning 10 people, bro, right? A lot of the stuff that you, and also, bro, one of the things that you've always talked about, I mean, I know you and me had lots of discussions about this, because like we had some some of our roots in some Sufism from the early days, both of our Islam. So we were always very, very interested in the whole spiritual dimension. You never gave up. I think neither of us ever gave up that sort of element of our dawah as well. All of that is very impactful, bro. So seriously, I think you're underestimating your contribution, bro. Even if I would say that the impact that you personally had and the contribution you've made to my growth in knowledge and insights and understandings and huge conversation. Oh, bro, how many hours we spent talking about stuff? So it's all been very beneficial, bro. And sometimes that's it. Sometimes you have a person and someone else is their translator. They just take what they say and they condense it, and that's what I love doing. What I like doing is taking complicated stuff and making it simple for people. Honestly, that's what I love doing, you know. So
and that's
how many gems and how many things and how many benefits I got from you, because I never until now can't access that Arabic.
With yourself as well, you know the level and degree of engagement. I'm referring to things, as you heard, that you maybe forgot about from the mid to early late 90s, on things that I've brought them up in the beginning of this podcast. So yeah, don't underestimate yourself. What I would say, and this has been fascinating. I think there does need to be a part 2. The reason Abdurrahim and I were excited to be bringing you on board is because that, you know, Abdurrahim and myself, we've used to spend hours traveling in cars and sitting in his house having breakfast. We will be, but we always, there's a convergence in what we're saying. And I think that there's a maturation that's taken place, certainly amongst us speaking now, with regards to understanding a wider context of Salafism and what it means and where it's gone and where it's morphed and everything like that. I still feel that there needs to be some sort of ownership, because we are in really perilous times now, where we've got liberal extremism amongst the Muslims, we've got esotericism that's going to an extent where people are committing shirk with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We've got a behavioral, as I call it, extremism from within, and those who are coming into Islam, which Abdurrahim, he was talking a week or so ago, which was right what he was saying, that it's just about calling to the Dawah. It's we need to call to Islam. The simplicity of that. And Abdurrahim has always stuck with that point, and I agree with that as well. But that simplicity, which is required, has got so many obstacles around it now, that when individuals are coming in and embracing Islam, their head's almost been turned 360 degrees. But what shouldn't happen is what we're seeing amongst particular Salafi cults, as it were, that you come into Islam and you're taught to hate immediately everyone and everything that's outside of that clique. And as you said, Ibn Taymiyyah, Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah likened it to the Khawarij in that splitting of subsidiary matters. So I feel that that the Muslim identity, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we must bang that drum or wear that badge of Salafiyah. That's what, when I say that, when that's happening, that's what I'm talking about, the bastardization, the Salafi uniform, and this particular restriction that's been placed on it by those who think that they're claiming and owning it, but in actuality, they're stifling the heartbeat of what it actually represents, mashallah, which is Islam. And that story, Abdurrahim and I know, and you know, when we were taught about the likening given of a stream of a group, a community that's settled by this pure stream, and they were taking and getting all their strength and their fresh water from that stream. But then the next generation started throwing pollutants into that stream, and basically they started becoming sick because they were drinking from it and throwing pollutants in. The enemy then came, conquered them, took possession of their land and everything, and then 3 groups emerged from that original community. The first one saying we need to build hospitals so that we can become well again. But others said, but then we're still going to be taking from the stream and it's polluted. The second group said, no, until we've conquered our enemies and we fought our enemies, we won't get our victory and our honor back again. We know who those first 2 groups are. The third group said, no, both of you, these things cannot happen until we have purified the stream. And the stream, and then the third group were the group who we would like to the Salafis, who were saying you need to purify the stream being Islam, the stream being Tawheed. And that similitude we are seeing played out today. So who are those today who are going to be saying we need to purify the Aqidah, we need to purify the Sunnah, we need to do that? Not in the way that we're seeing it being done by some elements today, but it still needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, Barakallah feekum for reminding me of that. Beautiful example. And you're right. My only concern is amali and practically. Ibn Taymiyyah has this one-liner somewhere in the Minhaj al-Sunnah, in his refutation of 12 Shi'ism. And he says that in the age of the, I think, Tabi'un, either the third or fourth generation, he said some of the Muslims were fighting on the frontiers of what is present-day Turkmenistan and all those Stani areas in the old Russian province. He said many of those who were part of the military jihad campaigns fighting were affected by the Dawah of the Jahmiyyah. Now, I don't know if he means the Jahmiyyah or the Mu'tazila when he uses the word Jahmiyyah, because there were no such group called the Jahmiyyah, but there was a group called Mu'tazila. But let's just call them, as he did, the Jahmiyyah. And they were affected with the Dawah of the Jahmiyyah. They were Jahmis. And they would be part of the Muslim army that conquered new territories, inviting non-Muslims to convert to Islam. And many of those non-Muslims, they converted to Jahmi Islam because the Dawah givers there were the Jahmi. He said, but it's just so Ibn Taymiyyah, mashallah. This man is an utter genius. He says, it is better to be a Jahmi Muslim than a rejectionist kafir. My point of saying this is not that when we have an obligation to clarify what we believe to be the truth, we're lackadaisical about it, then we're sinful. But it's just to say that there are at least two scholarly competing visions of what Orthodox Islam, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is. Asharis and Salafis, Asharis and Atharis, whatever we want to call it, Asharis and Hanbalis in their, not madhab sense, in their theological sense. And whilst most Muslims probably don't need to concern themselves with it, all they have to believe in is Allah, the books, the angels, the messengers, the last day, Prophet Sallallahu is fine as a prophet. We can't make clear-cut halal things haram just because of a liberalization of culture and values, and that's all they basically need, okay, more than ever before. And some of the finer details, they might leave them to their fitna or to just dealing with the bigger kufr issues, okay, iman kufr issues, instead of sunnah bid'ah issues. There are two competing things, so we need to at least factor that in. And we can take either one of three stances. I mean, between us, we can only take two. We will only take one of two. But on the wide things, the scholars will take one of three. Either the Ash'ari Aqidah is best representative of Orthodox Islam, and the modern-day Salafi Aqidah comes second close, runner-up, but not quite there. Or the other side, which is more historically valid, that it's the Hanbali, Athari, Salafi Aqidah, which is Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and the Asharis come a second close, but not quite there. And that is historically much more valid than the first one I said. And again, it's objective, it's not subjective, because Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari came 100 and odd years after Imam Ahmad, who was already the Imam of Ahl Sunnah. Or we can take, well, actually, they're both from Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and where they differ, one is more right than wrong. One is right and one is wrong, but still within orthodoxy. We're going to have to, as I believe both of you already doing, just factor that in to the fact that we are not now faced with Sunnah bid'ah issues, Ahl Sunnah, Ahl bid'ah. We are faced with Iman and Kufr. Many people, not just in the West, but even in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, last edgy kind of survey of 2018. It's edgy because the kingdom doesn't give out statistics very, very happily or readily. It's about 13% atheism. 13% atheism. Let's Iran is coming up to like 18%, and most of them are from the young people, few elders. So it's all over. The West is all over the world. The liberal monoculture is all over the world, and that's what we have to face with. And most of the issues of people today will either be, and I'm talking about Muslims as well, loneliness. I'm confused about evolution. I'm confused about the Big Bang. Doesn't that explain things without God? Why can't we halalify the thing that was agreed to be haram? Is what really we're going to face. And so as long as we put Ahl Sunnah, Ahlul Bidah, Ashari, Athari in a context and put it in the place that it and the priority it has, then alhamdulillah, we have an obligation to be corrective in our dawah, whether in matters of behavior or matters of aqidah. The dawah by definition is corrective. The dawah of Tawheed is always corrective. It can't be but corrective. We have to correct mistaken notions. But I suggest, and this is something that you two preceded most of us on, we need to be correcting kufr ideas probably much more than we need to be correcting bid'i ideas in aqidah. That's how it seems to me today and for the last at least 15 years, and Allah knows best.
Jazakallah khair, Abu Ali, really on that. And I think I'm going to repeat, Abdurrahim will second me, I'm sure. You need to come back on the show. There's so many more
so
things.
Much more to discuss, absolutely.
And I hope you'll accept that invitation.
I'll be honored to. Barakallah feekum. I'll be really honored to. You're two people who I admire for so many different reasons, mashallah. And two people who I believe that Allah has really, blessed the people in Britain to have the efforts that I know that you've put in. And just for anyone listening who doesn't know Salafi Dawah, these things were being done with no pay from Saudi, actually with a conscious rejection of taking money from anyone. So the idea that these blotty books and these traveling to these things and these JIMAS summer conferences or autumn conferences worked through the cash of someone else, even though we believed it was halal, we never took a penny. Individually, we may have done something, whatever, but we never took a penny. So I hope that people who are not part of that dawah would appreciate and would perhaps, that will be my corrective today. Let's put that myth to bed, inshallah. And mashallah, and you too, mashallah, Allah gave you tawfiq, and Allah may Allah continue to give you both.
And you, what I would say, look, Ikhwan, we could go on for ages, but what I'm going to say is this, alhamdulillah, Abu Ali, be ready. We're going to speak to you maybe about next week, inshallah. I think there's so much more to discuss. What Ismail Howell from Croydon was on. He sent his salams up earlier on, and some over there. I hope brothers found it beneficial. This is going to be shared far and wide, and there's more to discuss, as I've said. And I want to say to both of you, Jazakallah khair. And that's Sakil Abu Alia, that's Abdurrahim Anthony Green,
and that's Tony Baker.
And this has been a Pinch of State. Jazakallah khair, everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. MashaAllah.